So, for this week in our discussion of the Restoration and Restoration literature, I've broken it up into three prominent figures: the wits and the libertine. And the first of our kind of major literary characters, or not literary characters, but literary authors, is John Dryden. And the more I thought to myself, I thought that it would be remiss of me to not have you guys read something by John Dryden. He is the commanding literary figure of the age. His name is really synonymous with Restoration literature, and indeed, the period of 1660 through 1700 is known as the Age of Dryden. Every aspect of Restoration life, political, religious, philosophical, artistic, finds expression somewhere in his writing. His early years were dedicated to the theater and plays, and writing in some, what some would say would be the spirit of the age, in that his plays were very entertaining. He wrote predominantly to earn money, but his later years, he really discovers that he has this gift of writing satire and prose and literary criticism. Through his writing, his foremost achievement was to bring the pleasures of literature to every increasing reading public of Britain. He, as a critic and translator, he made the classics available to men and women who lacked classical education. His canons of taste and theoretical principles set the standard for the next generation. And though his plays go out of fashion, his poems don't. His satire inspired the most brilliant verse satirist of the age, which is Alexander Pope, into the next century, who will read. And he establishes the neoclassic Augustan style that shapes the next 100 years of literature. Guys, if it wasn't for John Dryden, we would not have, the works of the 18th century could not have happened were it not for this man. So he is our first focus of the week. Our second focus, author of focus this week, is John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester. And he is the second son of one of Charles II's most loyal followers, and he gains the king's favor and is distinguished as the man who has the most wit and least honor in England. And where John Dryden shapes the direction of the 18th century, no other writer embodies the spirit of the Restoration better than John Wilmot. And he's writing during what I like to call the age of hedonism. It's a very small part of what's happening in literature at the time, but it's also the one that's the most prominent during Charles II's reign. And this type of literature really evolves from the metaphysical and cavalier poets. When we think of that kind of metaphorical conceit where we have these two, when we have metaphors that are surprising and witty and not obvious, married to the cavalier poets, kind of carpe diem, seize the day, all of that kind of love and sexual innuendo that goes on with both of these guys. Someone like John Wilmot really kind of embodies that train of thought. This kind of loss of moral touchstones happens when when we have this kind of return to the monarchy, where they kind of want to rediscover or recover what was lost in the Commonwealth, but also to rebel against those moral puritanical ideals that the Commonwealth represented. And this is where we get the rise of the figure of the libertine. And a libertine is this kind of romantic rover who believed that sexuality was natural and overwhelming, and as such beyond the control of institutions such as religion. So sexuality is this kind of form that it should be free from social constraints like marriage and constancy. So John Wilmot really embodies those kinds of themes. As you'll see in his poetry, there's this duality, or this tension between pleasure and frustration, power, weakness, control, helplessness, man, woman, war, and love. And what's interesting about John Wilmot is that his poetry really illustrates satirical wit, which Dryden talks about a lot. And he directs that wit not only towards the ordinary man, but to prominent figures like John Dryden and Charles II. And this wit that his poetry that he kind of directs toward everyone, embroiled him in constant quarrels and exile, and his practical jokes, his affairs, and his libertine lifestyle make him a legendary literary figure. And because most of his writing deals with sex, and it's written about frankly, and more so than anyone else in England or in English literature before the 20th century. And because of his sexual escapades, he contracts syphilis, and that turns his brain into basically Swiss cheese. And he, as you'll see in the Disabled Debauchee, really takes a toll on him physically. And ultimately, he kind of ends up rotting from the inside out. And his life, if you've never heard of him before, he is the inspiration of the major motion picture The Libertine, which stars Johnny Depp. And I recommend, if this is something that you're interested in, I recommend everybody to watch this film. It's bizarre and odd and dark and creepy, as in only Johnny Depp could do it justice, or do him justice. So John Wilmot's literature really embodies, in some regards, one of the tones set in the Restoration period in a way that John Dryden does not. And our final literary figure of the week is Aphra Behn. And she is John Dryden called her a wit of the day in his letters. And she is the first real woman to turn to writing as a career. She's friends with John Dryden, and within the literary community, she faces a lot of backlash because she is indeed a woman. And she wrote famously that were she a man, she would not receive the criticism that she received. So we'll focus on Aphra Behn as in response to one of John Wilmot's poems, the Imperfect Enjoyment. So our readings for the week, it looks like it's a lot, but it's really not, because they're all very kind of short poems, and the art of satire is a short little paragraph of prose. But we're going to focus on Annus Mirabilis, or the Year of Miracles, is an excerpt in your text about the burning fire of London and the restoration of the city. And John Dryden's definition of satire in his commentary on the progress of satire. We're going to read John Wilmot II, Earl of Rochester's The Disabled Debauchee and The Imperfect Enjoyment. And I warn you in advance that these are pretty bawdy and graphic poems. And then we'll close out our readings with The Disappointment. So I am trying something new this week, in that we aren't going to have normal lectures on each of these poems, and instead I want to come together collectively in an optional Zoom meeting where we together discuss each of these readings, both individually and in how they kind of work together. And so I'm making that an optional assignment, which you guys will see. And if you do decide to, you can participate in this week's Zoom meeting where we discuss the literature. You will not be responsible for completing the discussion boards for the week. You'll earn 100% of your credit for the discussion this week. But if you can't, I will make the lecture available. I will record it, and you will in order to recoup those points, you can participate in the discussion board. So that's all I have for you in terms of lecture, and I hope that you all will come and participate in on our Zoom discussion of the literature. So I'm going to leave it here, and we will talk more fully about the individual readings for the week and all of these great minds of the Restoration era. And I'm interested to see what you guys think about the definition of satire and how it's applied in these three poems, but also in what you think of the literature that really embodies those Restoration ideals.